for our second panel. We are very, very pleased to have this really terrific group of speakers, just the ones that concluded and the ones who are speaking now. I neglected before when we started this event, but now I have all your rapt attention to remind you about some upcoming WITA events. Next week, we're going to be having an event looking at Brexit. If folks who are following this may know, next week they're going to be holding 3 votes on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I believe, voting on the Prime Minister's deal again on Brexit, whether to leave with no deal or to seek a delay from the European Union in the Brexit, which is timeline, which is the end of March. Try to push that off for several weeks. Very complicated issue, and we have some terrific and smart people representing American industry, British industry, and Irish industry coming to talk about what Brexit is, what's happening with Brexit, and what businesses should be doing and thinking about and preparing for what some of the eventualities may be. Later in the month, we are hosting Senator Pat Toomey, and we'll be discussing both with him and in a panel discussion about congressional authorities and trade in the context of Section 232. And then the first week in April, we'll be hosting an event on U.S.-Japan trade negotiations, which didn't really come up in our other discussions, but may get alluded to here. So with that, we're going to start our next panel. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Arit Frankel, who's an old friend of WITA and myself, runs something called the American Leadership Initiative in addition to her other responsibilities. Barbara Wiesel, Kevin Liu, and Drew Quinn, thank you all for joining us. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Arit.
Thanks, Kevin. Ken, I like that emphasis on the word old friend. But anyway, welcome everybody, and what a great panel we had just prior. So we have a hard act to follow. But I think we're going to pull back. We had a great discussion of TPP, CPTPP, RCEP, WTO, and all the trade architecture in the region. And I think we're going to pull back a little bit and look at some of the broader economic issues facing us in Asia Pacific. I think, as everybody knows, a decade ago, President Obama announced, his pivot to Asia and really increased focus on China and in particular on ASEAN, and really that effort culminated with the negotiation of TPP. And in the past couple of years, we've seen kind of a 180-degree turn with the U.S. withdrawing from TPP and in general pulling back from its leadership in the region. We didn't send anyone senior to APEC this past year and have downgraded participation in the other regional fora. And at the same time, of course, escalated tensions dramatically with China, imposed 232 tariffs on many of our other regional partners. China, of course, has really taken advantage of the vacuum that the U.S. left. President Xi spoke at Davos a year ago talking about virtues of the open global economy. China's Belt and Road Initiative has really accelerated, putting, I think, pressure on a lot of countries in the region to move closer to China without the U.S. there as a counterbalance. So we have a great panel today to really analyze a lot of these trends and the challenges that it puts the U.S. and U.S. companies in. We're going to start off with Barbara Wiesel of Rock Creek Global Advisors, who was a TPP negotiator, but is really going to look at where we are today. We're going to move to Kevin Liu, who is the vice partner and chairman of the Asia Partner Group, who is really, their focus is China, so he's going to give us the view from China and look at current trends and dynamics from China, and finish with Drew Quinn, who is really going to give us, with GE, who's going to give us the business perspective. We're going to then I'm going to pose a couple questions and then we'll throw it out to the audience for discussion. So, Barbara?
Thanks, and thanks for having us. I want to step back, as Arit said, to think about the region a little differently than the previous panel, which discussed sort of the status of where we are in negotiations in various regions, and reflect on developments as you step back. And now I have the luxury of doing that since I'm no longer in the government, and I can kind of take time to reflect on where things are. And the issue that's at the top of my mind these days as I look at the region is the long-term implications of the current U.S. trade policy, the implications for U.S. commercial and strategic interests in the region, not just now but over time, and also for global trade governance. In that regard, I want to look at some of the negotiations that are going on sort of through that lens. As Arit said, and as you all well know, the administration rejected the approach of the previous administrations, including withdrawal from TPP, and said, we're going to negotiate bilaterally. We think a bilateral approach is better. It will provide us more leverage, and so we'll put all of those other agreements in the past and we'll negotiate bilaterally. And this is what the administration said was that this approach is better. It will result in higher standard agreements because we have more leverage, and we don't need to focus on all of these various small countries that were included, for example, in TPP. We will focus on the major trading partners, the countries that are really important to us commercially are those that we will focus on, and we will do this very quickly. As those of us who have negotiated know, and all of you who follow these trade agreements, moving quickly on trade is not a feature of U.S. trade policy. The U.S. is not well positioned to negotiate agreements quickly. Trade is a shared responsibility between the executive and the legislative branch, and that process is very slow, and so it makes moving trade agreements, even if there's a desire to negotiate serially a whole bunch of trade agreements quickly, that's something that's extremely difficult to do under the best of circumstances. Nonetheless, under the threat of 232, the administration began negotiations with a number of countries, including Korea, and negotiated KORUS fairly quickly. I know the administration has been touting the renegotiation of KORUS as a major renegotiation, but for those who look at the actual details of what was negotiated, you know that it is sort of a very minor set of elements that were renegotiated in KORUS. And of course, the administration has now just concluded negotiation of USMCA and did that over the course of many months. We'll start with Japan and the EU shortly, and those negotiations, I think similar, will be complex. So the U.S. has this bilateral strategy and a commitment to move quickly, but constraints for doing so. At the same time, as we all listened in the last panel, the rest of the Asia Pacific has been working as quickly as they can to negotiate as many agreements as they can. Japan helped lead the remaining 11 TPP countries to the conclusion of CPTPP, and I think I'll let Drew speak to how the U.S. Private sector is looking at this, but I think what I would say generally is that it's a positive thing for the United States that the rest of the 11 countries managed to conclude the agreements so that they maintain the rules even if U.S. companies don't have the preferential access directly through the agreement. And now they're working to expand the agreement, and there are other countries that are interested in joining, as was discussed in the last panel. Another set of initiatives that was not discussed in the last panel, but I think bears watching, is what the EU is doing in the Asia Pacific. The EU has been negotiating a series of agreements with countries across the Asia Pacific. It has concluded agreements with Japan and Singapore and Vietnam. Japan and Singapore are in force. Vietnam has yet to be ratified, but should be ratified hopefully this year. And the EU is continuing to negotiate with Indonesia and other countries in the region. Their goal is to negotiate a larger network of FTAs to put together these bilateral agreements into a bigger set of agreements so that it can have its own regional standard and architecture in the Asia Pacific. As it does through its trade agreements with other countries, the EU is pursuing its rules and its standards in these agreements as well as market access. So the EU is very active, the Asia Pacific countries are very active. We talked about RCEP in the last panel. RCEP is moving along. I have heard various people talk about the momentum that we're seeing in RCEP and the fact that many countries think that it may be done by the end of 2019. I think the jury's out, but we're watching. Best of luck. And then the other set of activities that is going on is, of course, what China is doing. China does not have a trade negotiating strategy outside of the RCEP, but it is through the Belt and Road Initiative advancing its own set of rules throughout the region. While some countries may be somewhat reluctant to accept the terms of the deals that China is offering through BRI, they are very much in need of the financing for infrastructure and are therefore accepting a lot of the rules through the BRI and the Digital Silk Road, and resulting in increased dependence on China, but also the promotion of Chinese governance and rules in the region. I noted some press over the last couple of days about this article in the People's Daily last week that said China believes that the world is at the crossroads of progress, with the global governance system undergoing profound changes and a new international order being nurtured. It wants to change or transform the system to its benefit and through the BRI and other initiatives. And I think that that is very much the way that I view what China is doing kind of quietly through BRI without a major headline kind of marquee initiative in terms of a trade agreement. It is pursuing these same objectives through the BRI. And this is very much of a long-term strategy. It is setting up supply chains, it is setting up new rules and standards and promoting its vision across the Asia Pacific. So, just to summarize, the U.S. has this bilateral strategy that's moving slowly, and it is beginning to negotiate with several countries, but many of the other countries have a very long-term vision of what it is they're trying to do in the region and are very aggressively pursuing it. Secondly, second topic I just want to touch on briefly, and I'm probably going well over time, is that the U.S.-China negotiations, and I will not get into the details of it because I know you're going to, but all eyes are on the outcome of these talks. And over the course of the last several months, what you've heard from the private sector is many companies applauding the fact that the Trump administration has been willing to play hardball and use leverage that has not been used in the past to get concessions from China. And even those who disagree with the imposition of tariffs will acknowledge that they agree with the 301 report concerns, and they agree that it's about time that the United States was serious in addressing some of these issues. But when I step back again from a long-term perspective, I want to say that I think most in the U.S. will judge the success of China's policy based not just on the specific commitments, but also the longer-term implications. So for the immediate evaluation of the package, there are many more questions, I think, at this point than there are answers. But the questions are, what concessions will Japan make? Do they constitute meaningful market opening, or are they more of a shopping list? What did the U.S. have to offer in return for China's concessions? Will the tariffs that the U.S. imposed be removed, and will the retaliatory tariffs be removed? Will this deal succeed in opening China's market and addressing long-term structural issues? I think it's certainly unfair to assume that a single deal is going to resolve all of these issues that were listed in the 301 report, but is it possible that there will be continuing discussions, and what will those look like, and how will the monitoring and enforcement work? Those are all issues under discussion, and I think that people are looking at as they evaluate the deal. In terms of monitoring and enforcement, this is obviously a key element of the deal, and it's one area where Ambassador Lighthizer has been pretty open about his thinking. Under the monitoring and enforcement system that he's described, there will be regular meetings monthly, quarterly, and biannually to discuss specific issues of concern. When I look at this setup, I think, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not still in the government. This is incredibly labor-intensive, meeting monthly to discuss all of these issues. I think would be very difficult. But beyond the sort of heavy labor-intensive structure that was set up here, I think there's also the question of how dispute settlement would work, and Ambassador Lighthizer has been more vague on this issue, but I think what you read into the comments that he says is that there would be no formal dispute settlement process, that the U.S. wants to retain the right to use 301 and to basically be the judge, jury, and executioner to be able to impose tariffs if it didn't like the manner in which China responded to the concerns that were raised. And presumably China would have the right to retaliate. This raises a lot of concerns about the perpetual uncertainty that would be created by a dispute settlement system like this, and the likelihood of periodic flare-ups or trade wars between the U.S. and China. Again, standing back and looking at this from the long term, I think that this is a concern as a significant departure and erosion of the rules-based trading system that we helped create, and perhaps a system that one might question whether we would want to replicate in the future. Overall, when I look at the region and how the administration has approached both bilateral negotiations and the work with China, what I would say is that U.S. administrations have traditionally focused on building and strengthening the rules-based trading system. We focused on free trade and open markets. We've understood that unless the U.S. was the first mover in setting trade rules, U.S. businesses would become rule takers, as we're seeing in some areas like digital trade in the Asia Pacific. The U.S. had assumed leadership roles and built alliances and partnerships that brought our Asia Pacific partners together in developing common visions of our economic future. And the U.S. pursued trade governance frameworks that were sound and durable, that were built for the future, and advanced principles and principled approaches for the region and the world. At the beginning of the Trump administration, they said, it's time for us to reconsider all of these approaches that have been taken since the end of World War II, and it was time to reevaluate. And of course, it's good to periodically reevaluate the approach, and sometimes it's even good to disrupt the approach. And that's certainly what the Trump administration has done through its trade policy. Overall, I think when you look at what they've done, you can see there may be some short-term victories from the approach they've taken. But I come back to where I start about the overall concern that I have about the long-term implications of this type of policy, of a more unilateral approach, a more zero-sum approach, and a more transactional approach, and how those will affect the U.S. strategic and commercial interest over the long term.
Thanks, Barbara. We're now going to turn to Kevin for the view from China.
Great, thank you. As our moderator mentioned, I run the Asia business for Partners Group. It's a Swiss private equity firm. So I'm coming more from an investor perspective, and the reason is that I run the Asia business with about 400 people in Asia. We both invest into Asia, China included, as well as we invest Asian capital globally. One of the most frequent topics we look at in our investment process today is connectivity, right? When you buy a company that no matter where they are, and one of the questions is how does this company connect to the other companies or other economies? So in that context, trade becomes a fairly relevant topic for us. My second angle is I do advise some of the Asian organizations. I'm on the advisory panel for MAS in Singapore and a couple of other Asian policy making bodies. So let me maybe mostly focus on China, the U.S.-China sort of the challenges we see today, and I jotted down a few random sources I share with you. The first is that I think whenever we look at China topics, it's important to remember that it's usually, I wouldn't say 100%, it's usually come from the domestic angles, right? I mean, if you look at the role of China or how they have developed versus what the US has been doing, is that US is much more intermediary, whether it's US dollar being the reserve currency or the Wall Street as the sort of the intermediaries of capital flows. China has never played that role, right? The Chinese economic growth has been really driven by its manufacturing capabilities and today the size of the market. And China tried very hard, but they never was able to gain that intermediation role, right? So therefore, when you talk to Chinese policymakers, you know, their first priority is not about whether this disintermediate us or does this allow our. I know there's a lot of discussions in media about how China want to be strategically positioned, replace the United States. Me personally, I don't see that. They come from domestic economy. How do they manage the domestic economy? The international topics, including trade, come second, right? So with that point in mind, I think it's important to look at where the Chinese economy is, right? So, I mean, you can write many books about that, but my 2 minutes version would be, if you look at the last, I would say 15 years under Hu Jintao for 10 years, now under Xi Jinping for more than 5 years, I guess a simple way for me to summarize is that a lot of the short-term dividends that China has been reaping over the last 4 decades are used up, right? So this is a time where China has to find new angles. It has to make structural improvements of its economic model. It has to attach more importance innovation than, frankly, copy and paste other people's technology. Also, it's now, I contradict my first point, is that they now attach a lot more importance on connectivity compared to before, right? So Barbara mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. It was, I'm quite familiar with how that policy was written at a very working level, and it was sitting in the desk, for many years. Actually, nobody took it up. Even today, right? I wouldn't even call that a strategy. I think for me, the BRI is just about connectivity. It's just about China today. We recognize the importance of connectivity, and it just throws an idea out and see how other countries would react to that, right? I haven't seen, unlike a lot of the Chinese policy documents where you have 125 KPIs and milestones, I have never seen a document related to BRI that says here's our strategy to take the world and to somehow replace US dollar. I have never seen that. To me, it's a mindset. It's a mindset China today at this particular stage of development. They think connectivity matters more than before. They want the other countries to think about it as well. Right? I remember I was in Baku a year ago. I was talking to my friends in Azerbaijan, right? So they were like, oh yeah, this is, for them, the way they see those smaller countries who suffers more from lack of connectivity find this a very refreshing way to look at things, right? For them, I remember my friends there who was running their free trade port was like, oh, look at history. Baku was If you look at the global trade routes or whatever, we were like a two-star hotel. All we want to do is under this BRI umbrella become a 4-star hotel, right? We would never be what Tehran did, many years ago, or Istanbul. So for them, they get it. They get it. They also get it. It's not a prescriptive thing, right? And Barbara mentioned about the rules of the Chinese rules under BRI. I don't see them. I genuinely don't see a coherently defined set of rules. China says this is how we're going to trade, how this is different. Other than the traditional, obviously China has a non-interference policy, right? All these things. I just don't see a very prescriptive thing on the connectivity side. But so the Chinese economy, again, they need structural improvement, they need more innovation, they need connectivity. So that's why in that context, I'm very optimistic about the U.S.-China negotiation. I wrote an article in November on foreign policy that essentially predicted what the outcome today, that you saw on Wall Street Journal yesterday, is that there is a range of issues U.S.-China are dealing with, but many of those issues, whether it's trade imbalance, whether it's intellectual property, it serves China's interests because China needs structural investment, it needs innovation, it needs connectivity, and I think a lot of self-interests of China are being served in this process in a disruptive way, in a more disruptive way than we had expected, probably without this U.S. administration pushing very, very hard, right? So that's why I'm a firm believer from the very beginning of this process. When talk about there will be big trade war, as an investor, I don't worry about it. I think that there will be a bargain between these two countries. It's also because my last 30 seconds is that it's also because frankly, China has accumulated a lot of things it can give today, right? A lot of the reforms has been in the drawer for the last few years in terms of, for example, opening up for investment in financial sector. It has been there for 3 years. They could have done that 3 years ago. They didn't do it for whatever domestic reasons. Today, it's not difficult for them to present and formally launch those reforms. Those are good for the Chinese economy. They need to do it anyway. And if they could include that in part of the package with the U.S. that allows more access to companies here, that's why not, right? So I'm very optimistic both from what the Chinese economy, domestic economy needs. I think a lot of the good things will come out from this run. Again, in spite of the process that makes people worry about it. So that's sort of my short comments.